Hence it is styled, quote, an election of grace, and if it be of grace, it is no more of works, otherwise grace is no more grace, unquote. Such is the uniform language of Scripture. In favor of foreseen faith and good works, there is not a single text in the Bible. Romans 8, verses 29 and 30, the only one on which you seem to rely, is perfectly silent on the subject. It does not say that God predestinated to life those who he foreknow would believe and perform good works. This is what you would probably say, but the Scriptures say no such thing. Whatever be the meaning of the phrase, quote, whom he did foreknow, the Arminian gloss cannot be the true one. The term Arminian is used merely as a term of distinction, not of reproach. That predestination is not founded on foreseen faith and good works is demonstrably evident from this: that faith and good works upon Arminian principles cannot possibly be foreseen. Arminians maintain that it depends upon the self-determining power of the will whether any person believe or do good works. Upon their principles, every individual person may refuse to believe. Now, if any individual may refuse to believe, all may refuse to believe. According to this scheme, it was possible that not one promise made to the Redeemer with regard to the salvation of sinners should ever be fulfilled. It was possible that the Redeemer should never see, quote, one of his seed, one of the travail of his soul, unquote. It was possible that notwithstanding all our mediator has done and suffered, not one single soul should ever believe, that not one single soul should ever be saved. It was possible that all mankind might continue in unbelief and wickedness and perish eternally. Now, I would be glad to know how it was possible for God to have a certain foreknowledge of those who should believe and do good works, when it was possible that none would ever believe or do good works. Believe me, dear sir, had your prudence been equal to your, quote, exasperated indignation, unquote, you would have studiously avoided any controversy about the foreknowledge of God. Arminians have labored for ages, but labored in vain, to reconcile their system with this divine attribute. Tillotson, Groves, Abernethy, Dr. Sam Clark, and a whole host of philosophers and divines have exerted their combined energies and exhausted their gigantic powers in fruitless efforts to accomplish this more than Herculean labor. The present learned and acute Dr. Adam Clark has not been a whit more successful than his predecessors. Quote, we grant, says the doctor, that God foresees nothing as absolutely and inevitably certain, which he has made contingent, and because he has designed it to be contingent, therefore he cannot know it absolutely and inevitably certain. I conclude that God, although omniscient, is not obliged, in consequence of this, to know all that he can know, no more than he is obliged, because he is omnipotent, to do all that he can do, unquote. This is to cut, but not to loose, the Gordian knot. It is the dernier resort, the forlorn hope of Arminians. It is to deny one of the perfections of God, rather than give up a favorite system. Though in words the learned doctor acknowledges the omniscience of God, yet in fact he denies that attribute. If the deity is not possessed of the actual knowledge of all things, but only the power of knowing all things, he is not omniscient. To say that the supreme being, has a power of acquiring knowledge is the same as to say that at one period of his existence he may be comparatively ignorant, and at another period more knowing, that his knowledge may increase with his years, that he may become wiser as he grows older. If the deity is capable of any ascensions of power, he is not omnipotent. In like manner, if he is capable of any accessions of knowledge, he is not omniscient. To say that God is omniscient and yet deny that he must know all things is a contradiction in terms. It is as great a contradiction as to maintain that he is omnipotent and yet deny that he must be possessed of all power. To say that the deity is not possessed of all power is to deny his omnipotence. To say that he is not possessed of all knowledge is to deny his omniscience. The doctor therefore denies the omniscience of God. He acknowledges the name, but denies the thing. But still farther, by denying that the deity has the actual knowledge of all things, and maintaining that he has only the power of knowing all things, Dr. Clark has gained just nothing at all. The difficulty remains the same. The question still recurs. How can the deity, on Arminian principles, be possessed of such a power? How can he foreknow things which are contingent, things which may never come to pass? As knowledge presupposes the certain existence of the thing known, so foreknowledge presupposes the certainty of the future existing of the thing foreknown, of the future existence of the thing foreknown. If the deity knows that Dr. Clark is at present a believer, it is certain that Dr. Clark is a believer. If it is possible that Dr. Clark is no believer, whilst the deity knows him to be a believer, then it is possible for the deity to be mistaken. So, in like manner, if the deity foreknew from all eternity that Dr. Clark would be a believer, it was certain from all eternity that Dr. Clark would believe. If it was possible that Dr. Clark might never believe, though the deity foreknew that he would believe, then it was possible for the deity to be mistaken. Every person must see that it is impossible for the deity to know that a thing exists if it does not really and certainly exist. Equally impossible is it to foreknow that a thing will exist if its future existence is not certain. That these things are equally impossible, the doctor himself must acknowledge, for, according to his own doctrine, foreknowledge, after-knowledge, and present knowledge are all the same. With the deity there is nothing, strictly speaking, but present knowledge. To say, therefore, that the deity knows that a thing exists, and yet that it is possible that it does not exist, is to say that the deity has a certain knowledge of its existence, and yet has no certain knowledge of it. In like manner, to say that the deity foreknows those things which will exist, and yet that those things may never exist, is the same as to say that the deity has a certain foreknowledge of their future existence, and yet that he has no certain foreknowledge of it. Again, to say with Dr. Samuel Clark, Mr. Bird, and others, that God foreknows necessary events as necessary, and contingent events as contingent, is to say nothing at all to the purpose. The question still recurs, how is it possible that contingent events should be foreknown? Mr. Bird illustrates his reasoning by the following example. We see the sun shining over our heads, and at the same time we see a man walking upon the earth. The one we see is voluntary, the other is natural. He grants, however, that both must be done, or we could not see them at all. But he denies that they were both necessary before they were done. It was only necessary that the sun should shine, but not that man should walk. Now, in opposition to this, I contend that if it was necessary that the man should walk in order that he might be seen walking, it was equally necessary that he should walk in order to be foreseen as walking. The walking of a man is an event which must certainly and infallibly come to pass, as well as the shining of the sun, in order for either seen or foreseen. As knowledge and foreknowledge are the same with the deity, he can no more foreknow that will certainly, he can no more foreknow what will not certainly and infallibly exist than he can know what does not at present certainly and infallibly exist. Mr. Bird asserts that God necessarily foreknows all that will come to pass. Dr. A. Clark asserts that God is not obliged to know all that he can know. This flat contradiction in the principles upon which these gentlemen proceed does not prevent the doctor from declaring his own better. The doctor must pardon me for thinking that Mr. Bird's argument is no argument at all, because it affords no solution to the difficulty, and that his own is still worse because it fails in solving the difficulty, and involves, besides, not only a plain contradiction, but also the denial of a divine perfection. Here is a footnote. If the denial of one of the attributes of deity and the belief of a contradiction, which is capable of the strictest demonstration, be necessary to free Calvinists from the gross absurdities and blasphemies charged upon them by Dr. Clark, I am fully of opinion they will universally agree with me in thinking that the remedy is incomparably worse than the disease. They will regard the Arminian cause as desperate indeed, when, in defense of it, a gentleman of the learning and talents as Dr. Adam Clark is reduced to such extremities. Some of the most penetrating Arminian divines and philosophers have given it as their opinion that no man will ever be able to reconcile the contingency of future events with the foreknowledge of God. In this opinion I heartily acquiesce. I firmly believe that these things will never be reconciled, because I believe they're irreconcilable. If any man is able to prove that it is possible for a thing to be and not to be at the same time, if he can prove that it is possible to know a thing and at the same time not to know it, then he may prove that it is possible for the deity to foreknow those events which may possibly never come to pass. Thus, sir, it appears that predestination cannot be founded on foreseen faith and good works, because upon Arminian principles it is absolutely impossible that either faith or good works should be foreseen. It appears that the doctrine of our Westminster divines with regard to predestination is not only sanctioned by the Word of God, but the absurdity of the opposite opinion is capable of a demonstration as strict as any contained in Euclid's Elements. Calvinistic principles stand upon a proud preeminence. They rest upon the immovable basis of divine revelation and are consistent with the soundest principles of philosophy. Our moral philosophy classroom and divinity halls do not now resound with the doctrine of self-determining power of the will. The salt is now cast into the fountain. For more than half a century past, Calvinistic principles have been gaining ground both among the learned and illiterate. At present they are rapidly progressing. If I can rely on the testimony of one of themselves, a young gentleman of great respectability, the students of the Synod of Ulster have, for some time past, been almost universally Calvinists. From the new wine they are turning with listless apathy, with the general exclamation, quote, "The old is better," unquote. That the General Synod are retracting their steps, that they are returning to the Calvinistic principles of their ancestors, is a fact which I believe admits of little doubt. The unanimity displayed in their judicious appointment of a divinity professor speaks volumes on this interesting subject. And indeed, from my inmost soul, I congratulate them on their return to what I conceive to be the true and genuine principles of the gospel. Quote, "I have no greater joy than to see," quote, unquote, "Christians of every denomination," quote, "walking in the truth," unquote. I am, etc. Letter number 7. My reverend and dear Presbyterian, I flattered myself that the vengeance you had taken on your enemies in your hard-fought battle of dialogues would have fully gratified your, quote, "exasperated indignation," unquote. I flatter myself that after the battle was over, the Westminster divines would find the Reverend Presbyterian a generous foe. It never once entered into my mind that so illustrious a warrior would return again to the field of battle for no other purpose than to insult and abuse the wounded and dying. In this it appears I have been mistaken. In your battle of dialogues you have knocked down, or thought you had knocked down, your enemies. You return in your appendix to kick them for falling. You assure us that the Westminster Confession, quote, "is not only inconsistent with the Scriptures, but that it is many times inconsistent with itself," unquote. To establish this charge, you give a garbled account of the 3rd section of the 9th chapter, after which you exclaim, quote, "How miserable then is the state of this unregenerate man, since if he pray to God it is a sin, and since if he pray not it is a greater sin," unquote. In the section referred to, the divines teach that the works of unregenerate men, though they may be materially good, being done according to the divine command, and useful both to themselves and others, are nevertheless sinful on a variety of accounts, because they do not proceed from faith. For without faith it is impossible to please God. Because they do not proceed from love. For though we give all our goods to feed the poor, and have not charity, it profiteth nothing, etc. The divines also teach us that the neglect of these works is still more sinful and displeasing to God. This they establish as irrefragable evidence. If we give our alms to be seen of men, we have no reward. Without charity, giving all our goods to feed the poor profits nothing. And yet, at the judgment of the great day, men shall be condemned for neglecting acts of charity. Quote, "I was hungered, and ye gave me no meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me no drink," etc. "Inasmuch as ye did it not to the least of these, ye did it not to me," etc. Unquote.